Our second and then already last talk of this panel is by my very dear current and former colleagues Nina Patricia Houe and Jolene Blom from the IT University of Copenhagen and the Tampere University. They are going to give us a talk about, or not about, but with the title, It's Just Equipment Don't Get Attached, Caring About or Just Using Non-Player Characters. And with that, I very, very gladly give you to the word.
I'm afraid we can't hear you.
I think you're still muted, Nina.
Yeah.
There you go. I've shared my screen and you should
Yes.
be able to hear me. Great, excellent. Okay, so hi, I'm Nina. I'm from the IT University of Copenhagen. I'm doing a PhD focused on empathy and player experiences of relations to NPCs. Jolene, my co-author, is a postdoctoral researcher from Tampere University interested in characters and parasocial relationships, and I'll be doing the presentation today. This is a work in progress, I should note, so comments are very welcome. I basically just want to see if this is a duck that floats. Okay, so can we really care about NPCs without objectifying them? This seems to be a very central question to a lot of the presentations we heard yesterday. And as we've seen in so many of those presentations, it often seems impossible to do it. And the answer might be no. But then what if there's something else? So in this presentation, we're exploring how players' relationships with NPCs can be subject to object-based or subject to subject-based, and some differences between them. We will draw on theories on characters and parasocial relationships very briefly, talk about the distinctions between care and use as described by others also very briefly, because we got so many good examples yesterday. And then we'll try to see if Martin Buber's ideas about relations can tell us anything about the player and NPC relations specifically in order to make the distinction tangible. And then I try to apply all of this in a very short analysis of the player and character relationship in the game that's stranding between me and one NPC. In the interest of time, we'll stick to that one example and not talk about Catherine as originally planned. So in this presentation, we understand characters as both textual constructs and human-like entities. So we see them as quasi-persons as described by Frau, which means we assign them a consciousness and intentionality based on culturally learned conventions. But we also use them to do things and experience things. And that's why game characters are such a great resource of intimacy for players, as noted by Burgess and Jones and Tosca and Klastrup. Most research on characters focuses on the player character and not game characters in general, or even on NPCs. But the kinds of relations we have in NPCs are interesting nonetheless. One way to talk about these relations is as parasocial interaction, and especially parasocial relationships, which are simply put one-sided relationships with another who usually doesn't know we exist. And we got such a good rundown of that yesterday, so I won't go into depth about that and where it comes from. But basically, it's about relationships originally between spectators and performers on television, and how spectating characters at a distance can provide a sense of comfort for the spectator. Interestingly, most work on parasocial relationships focuses on real persons and not fictional characters or game characters who can, in some ways, return your feelings. Relationships with NPCs are interesting because they can be reciprocal in some ways, and you can influence them, at least partially. So we should consider what kind of relation we have with them. As lots of presentations yesterday have shown, non-utilitarian relation with an NPC is very hard to come by. When players are encouraged to care about NPCs by the game, it's mostly about rewards, consumption, and consumption of experiences or identities And there's some sort of a simplification going on of relationships as being just strategic processes. As stated by Renata yesterday, the discourse of love and care for game characters is a discourse of ownership, which seems not very well fitting with care. So are NPCs just there for us to take advantage of them, whether we think they enjoy it or not? How can we not? They invite it by luring us with the promise of love, heartbreak, and more lucrative eggs. Instead of focusing on the character or what we do to and for them, or how we feel about it, or why we care, we can try to look at the relation itself. And to do this, I'll now talk more about Martin Buber and a photo of me in a tree. So you are warned. I think we can understand the relationship between players and NPCs with Buber's terms because it forces us to put the player and the NPC in the background and focus on the relation itself. As Konstantin just said in the last presentation, Buber offers a different view on what it means to care for others in ways we're not used to think about. And I'm also very happy that Konstantin talked about Metal Gear because the example I'll use later complements it very nicely. So just to iterate, Martin Buber was a dialogic philosopher known for his work on intersubjectivity, mostly pertaining to religion, but also in relationships in general. His work has since been used to discuss relationships with AI and is centered around two stances of structural relation with the world and others in the world, I-it and I-you, or I-thou. The I-it relation is sensing, utilitarian, and objectifies the other for the sake of reaching a goal. The I-it world is thus similar to orientation, where we understand only the instrumental value of others, which can be anyone or anything, and we seek to exploit this. By relating in this way, we are isolated, according to Buber, encountering only one dimension of the other and letting that other only encounter one dimension of ourselves. In the I-it stance, we analyze, categorize, utilize, and experience the other. We can even use the other to feel emotion or for personal growth or to get insight into perspectives we don't have. Oftentimes, we'd like to name this empathy, even though it might be more focused on us than them. All of this belongs to the I-it. The I-it relation on the I-you relation, on the other hand, is characterized by the encounter for its own sake. Here we really relate to the other and not just to parts of them or parts of ourselves, like memories and experiences and thoughts and emotions. In this relational stance, the relation is a midpoint between two whole singularities. The encounter is characterized by an open and inclusive attitude with compassion and respect for the you-ness of the other. It's a momentary glance which we can only sustain as long as the idea of the relation is dominant. The I-you isn't good necessarily, and the I-it isn't bad necessarily, because we need to operate in the world with the I-it stance in order to function at all. And it's important to note that the you does not have to be a person or even a quasi-person or have any hints of perceived or imagined mental state or consciousness. Buber himself will talk about I-it and I-you relations with people, but he also talked about examples involving a tree, a cat, and even a piece of mineral. So it doesn't matter. And it's always possible for an I-it relation to be transformed into an I-you relation because both are always there, according to him. And this is the crucial bit. So here is, as promised, a picture of me in a tree. I can analyze the tree and its individual bits. I can categorize the tree as belonging to a certain type. I can use the tree to get shade or an okay back scratch, or use it as a climbing platform, or in this case as a prop for a silly photo. Or I can just experience the tree, how it feels and makes me feel. I can even imagine what it's like to be a tree, obviously very badly. So how do I not do any of this? Well, here in this photo, in this moment I was in, I didn't. I just wanted to climb it. But according to Buber, I could be in an I-you relation with this tree. So how? Why? Buber explains that I don't need to forget any of the perceptions that characterize the I-it relation to do this. No epoche necessarily at all or the like. He writes on page 56 in his book, one should not try to dilute the meaning of the relation. The relation is reciprocity. The tree has to deal with me in the moment just like I'm dealing with it. It occupies a spot in the world that I can't occupy because it's just there, the tree, whether I accept it or not. So what happens when I try to apply all of this to a relation between I, the player, and an NPC? In the I-it relation, I'm trying to get to grips with what this thing is and how I feel about it. So I may analyze the NPC's properties, functions, aesthetics, etc. I may categorize the NPC as belonging to one or more types and recognizing it as well within my own frame of reference. I may use the NPC to reach a goal and not acknowledged by the game or not. I may experience the NPC and interpret my experience of the NPC, for instance, focusing on the emotion I may feel for it. And all of this is egocentric at core, even with a game like that Dragon Cancer, which basically made me cry blood because I played it 2 months after giving birth the first time. I'm just using the game and the NPC to explore my own feelings, sometimes voluntarily, but often involuntarily. With the IU relation, I need to have an encounter, meaning to Buber a momentary point of connection, like sharing glances or having met as sort of equals, where I may perform and be aware of everything in the I-it stance, but for a moment, it just doesn't matter. What does that look like with an NPC? Can it be like Metalepsis, as when Sans winks at the camera in Undertale, or when Psychomantis reads info from my memory card in Metal Gear? Or is it when in The Last of Us Part 2, when hostile humans choked to death by me through Abby, the player character, looked directly into the camera exactly twice before dying, as if asking me to stop her? You might note also the similarity in the symmetry between these two screenshots. It's on purpose. Is an IU relation with an NPC possible at all? According to Buber, if there's an I-it relation, there has to be a primary IU relation as well, somewhere in there. I'll try to come closer to this by using the example of the character BB28 in Death Stranding. There's nothing new about exploring what is human or playing with the idea of character as either things or persons. Many games do this, many books do this, many films do this, etc., etc. Death Stranding, which is part horror game, part delivery simulator, part tactical stealth game, and a very excellent rendering, I have to say, of what it felt like for me to be on maternity leave with my firstborn, does this very honestly and playfully. It hands the player figure a baby in a pod with the declaration that it's just equipment. Try not to get attached. And of course, you're supposed to get attached, even though you are encouraged to treat it as any of your other tools at disposal. Throughout the game, the gruff hero protagonist opens up more, and BB28, the equipment vital for his progress, gets increasingly personified. Of course it does, look at it. Norman Reedus and his magical fetus is going to save America and become whole together. No surprise. What does the I-it relation with BB28 look like? There are lots of mechanics in the game that enforce care for the NPC as tool while constantly making you aware of the duality embedded in performing them. BB28 is a warning system that indicates the location and proximation of these ghostly aberrations you can see here up top. When they are very close, BB28 cries, and the cries stream out of the PlayStation controller, which is conveniently held right here next to your chest, as if holding an infant. When the danger has passed, the BB28 may have become so stressed that you need to recalibrate it. And to avoid it going into shock, being useless, you have to regulate its emotions through soothing. This happens like this. Not unlike soothing an actual infant, if successful, we lock gazes and BB28 calms down. And of course, taking care of BB28 will give you points, as in any game that emphasizes care. Here, the points are in the form of a 5-star reward system. It will be delighted, BB28. It will laugh and reward the player with Facebook-style likes when surviving BT combat, going fast, being stealthy, communicating with the NPC, bathing in a hot spring, or passing certain player-generated signs. So the relation is highly utility focused. Apart from care through utility supported by the narrative dimension, I can also look more at my own reception of the character. I experience personal distress as a response when I hear infants cry. I want to make it stop because it reminds me of my experience with my own children, especially when I couldn't make them stop. If you ever tried this, you know. I can't help to project my feelings and thoughts onto the relation, even though it's very dissimilar in many ways. So, if all of this is I it, what's left? An IU relation is an encounter where the idea of the relation itself dominates. Maybe it's a sort of shared inclusive moment between the NPC and player where it doesn't matter if other if the other really has a consciousness or not, or what we feel or how, but it's just there. Consider a moment in the game here where there's nothing left to do, and the soothing of the baby becomes different, at least to me. I find myself seeking eye contact with Louise, which is BB28's real name, when there's no reason to do so, really. And I have, but at a point I stopped comparing it to my own children or to characters I know, or projecting my feelings onto it because I've been there, done that. It's not about novelty or comfort anymore. For a moment, all of those things don't dominate the interaction and it's just there. She is. In a weird way, it's reciprocal. And then I decide to make Norman Reedus' character take off his shoes because it's fun for me when he damages them so severely that he has to rip off a toenail. Thank you.
Thank you, Nina. Should we stop the screen share?
Oh, yes.
Good. Then it is easier for me to see reactions and questions here. So, dear audience, do we have questions and comments and discussion? Yes, Feng, please go ahead.
Hi, thanks very much for a great talk. I thought that was really interesting. I just want to ask you a bit more about what drew you to Buber. I guess there's a lot of game scholars who are interested in non-anthropocentric, post-humanist, new materialist approaches, thinking about kind of decentering the human as a way of talking about different kinds of relationships or modes of awareness that might emerge. But perhaps you are looking at this in terms of foregrounding the ethical obligations of the player. So it's kind of I, you, or I, it. And is it to do with sort of getting the player to think about what they can and what maybe they should do in a game, or think about that? Just a kind of prompt for you to talk about that.
Right. So it's, and thank you for that very good question. It's because in my work on my PhD, which is mostly about empathy, I found that I can only get so much out of looking at responses, at theory of mind, at simulation, at all of these things happening in the subject and all of the things we perceive the object of empathy to be. So I started looking a lot into the relation specifically, and I started reading philosophers like Edith Stein, who've written a lot about empathy. And I came across Buber, and even though his work is somewhat not very well written, and he was notoriously also a very bad lecturer and sometimes didn't make sense, it just feels like there's something there that might be able to help me explain when I think there's a distinction between not seeing an NPC as an object, as a person, but the relation being different between me and an NPC when I objectify it and when I don't focus on those objective qualities, but the relation itself. I hope that was an answer that made sense.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. I thought the I relation was actually a very fine-grained way of talking about instrumental relationships, and so it's actually much more detail there than I've been able to articulate. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Do we have more questions? I have a bit of praise in the chat. That is always very welcome. Okay, while people are thinking, let me just ask one kind of, I don't know, pesky question. Having kind of played half of Death Stranding, I don't really know how it turns out. So I don't know if there are any big surprises coming in the end. But I completely understand what you're describing, that relationship between BB and Sam is really one that I think I can now describe much better with that terminology that you've introduced and also how you characterize it. So I totally buy all that. The question that I have is simply how important it is how the game primes us with the rest of its apparatus, right? Because it's not just a game, it's a Kojima game. There's lots and lots of cinematics, and those mysterious cinematics where we see Mads Mikkelsen's character obviously talk to a BB, and we at that point don't really know, are these the memories of our BB? Are those memories of Sam? Do they come from somewhere else? That is also influencing, I would at least argue, our relationship to those characters. Is that something that complicates this kind of thinking about games, or would you say that the ludic dimension is so much more powerful that that narrative component maybe isn't all that, I don't know, all that important? Do you have any ideas on that?
I think they really complement each other very nicely, and so it's a relatively new game, but I'll spoil it anyway because I want to prioritize my talk over your experiences. Sorry, and most people don't want to finish it anyway because it's a very tedious game. So you find out that BB-28 is a different BB than the one that you see in the cinematics. With in these like dream scenarios, and so the BB in those scenarios are actually Sam. And the interesting thing that happens throughout the game is that all of the characters are the same, the properties are the same, but the relations change. And so that's what I find interesting about the game, and that's what I'm trying partly to sort of describe using this, that it's sure we can talk about perception, but the relations themselves also change.
Yeah. Jolene, you are a speaker. You can just open your microphone and speak. You don't need to raise your hand.
Please do, please do.
Yeah, but I just didn't want to like suddenly interrupt Nina here. So I was like, how about I just like slightly raise my hand to say like, oh, maybe I have something to add too. And I think when it comes to like the ludic and the narrative, I think it's, aside from that, it's very hard to combine them, right? And I don't think that we can say that these relationships only happen in games or outside of games, or they only happen in stories or in narratives, because people do get attached to characters anyway outside of games or in other stories as well. But I think what really helps here, and games do that in many ways, although I think that Death Stranding does it in a particular way that I haven't really noticed it anywhere else yet. Just what Nina described, is that there are like certain mechanisms in there that constantly like ask us to put in effort and put in care. And sometimes it's a little bit more on the functional side, because in the end, we're trying to accomplish something with games, and some games are more on the side of creating feelings, which is more the dating simulators, but this game isn't. So it's a little bit more functional, but then there are like these components that we can't really solely describe as being a functional game mechanic, and they help us even more, I'd say, to establish this connection. But like I said, I haven't really seen it. I think I don't want to use the word unique, but Death Stranding is quite particular in how it does it.
Now we can discuss whether particular and unique are not new synonyms. Anyways, thank you very much. We have one more question in the chat, actually, where Sebastian wrote, how do you think the notion of resonance resonates with the relational approach you are suggesting? Now, I think Sebastian just dropped from the call, so we cannot ask him to elaborate on that. But do you have you any ideas about resonance?
Yes, I love the concept of resonance. I find it very interesting. Sadly, lots I could find on it wasn't very useful for what I wanted to talk about in my PhD dissertation, but I really want to use it. So I would really love to accept any tips on how to do that. But basically, a lot of things about resonance sort of harks back to this idea of similarity that we also have when we think about empathy, of copying, of simulating, of like copy pasting, of putting yourself into the other, which is, at least according to most of the definitions I use, the opposite of empathy. That's not empathy, that's just copy pasting, projection. But it's what is the original definition of empathy. So that's an interesting thing going there. But I find the idea of resonance very interesting, and I'd love to be able to use it more. So yes, that was a brief answer.
Thank you. And that, Sebastian, in case you were wondering, was an answer to your question. Okay, you saw it. Wonderful. Good. We started this talk a bit late, so we would have time for a last question, if there is one more. I am looking at the chat and I'm looking at the participant list. But maybe people are also in need of their first coffee break of the day. That seems to be the case. Then I would very much thank you both, and also thank Konstantin for your wonderful talks and everybody for their questions. This was really a pleasure. And with that, I would say thank you very much and give the word back to Ludmila.
Thank you so much, Houe, and thank you so much to all those who participated in the first panel. Amazing. And yeah, from my perspective, which is absolutely different from game studies, but even fashion related, I find it so much thought-provoking. And yes, it's time for a good cup of coffee or tea, and we are getting back in 15 minutes.